My team, kinda power. I love the power. I love the power.
Hi and welcome to the Big Footy Port Adelaide podcast. This is a weekly show dedicated to all things Port Adelaide Footy Club. I'm your host Macca 19, and with me as co-host is the very welcome return of Ford Fairlane. How are you, mate?
I'm good, yourself?
Yeah, great, buddy, great. And for the very first time on the podcast, we've got one of the most revered and respected figures on our forum. It's the one and only RussellEbertHandball.
Good evening, Ford. Good evening, Macca. Thanks for the invite.
Not a problem at all. Now, as we do with all the newcomers, we'll find out a little bit about REH and how he came to support about Port Adelaide.
Yeah, I was thinking about this during the week. I definitely know that I watched every game of the year when I was 10 years old and I went to a new school, so that was 74. But some point between 1970, I remember watching the prelim final on TV. We lost to Glenelg, and I definitely remember watching the elimination final, Jack Carroll's game. I became a rusted-on sort of supporter. It was a combo of things, I guess, mates at school, a few of them. I went to a small Catholic school from grade 1 to 4, and then grade 5 was when I said I went to a school and started playing footy, and I watched every game. I had a sort of cousin who was a bit cool because he'd sort of lived in America and he was maybe about 6 or 7 years older, and he was a Port man, so he probably influenced me.
Yep.
And another cousin sort of did. My uncle Seth took me to have a look at the old Juventus before they became Adelaide City, and I liked the black and white stripes. I think that had a bit of influence. And also, both sides of my family are immigrants, but they started on the west. But I grew up in the east side of town, Titri Gully, Hope Valley sort of area. But my mum's side of the family stayed on the western suburbs. And my uncle owned a construction earthwork sort of company, and he actually solved the problem of how to dig up West Lakes, and he ended up digging up the lake.
Yeah, right.
And so when we were sort of 5, 6, 7 years of age, you used to go and spend a week or two down at Grandma's, and Grandpa had a big block, and next to them was Uncle Vince's sort of yard. And so I sort of saw West Lakes being dug out, and I remember Footy Park being sort of built. And so I was all sort of on that side of town, not really a regular basis, but, you know, we'd go over there occasionally, and then you'd have that sort of holiday period. So I sort of knew the area. So that probably... a combination of those things is why I ended up being a Port supporter, and, you know, they were doing well, and obviously that helps. But yeah, so I was rusted on by 1974, I reckon, by the time I was 10.
Beautiful, beautiful. So do you remember what your first game was that you went to?
Adelaide Oval. It was Port versus North, because my folks really went into footy, and I used to go to footy. There was 3 of us that used to go, and 2 of us were Port men and 1 was a North man. And his mum was North. Craig's mum was North, and Craig's dad was Sturt, so I saw a lot of Sturt and North games as well. And that was Adelaide Oval, and I went to 75 and 76 Ford that Port played at Adelaide Oval, wasn't it? So it would have been 1977, the first game back at Alberton.
Yep.
The game against Norwood, there must have been 22,000 people, absolutely crammed.
Oh, was that game?
4 points. So that was the first game I saw at Albion, because we saw a few games at Adelaide Oval, and also a few games at Footy Park in 70. Yeah, we didn't go. I don't think I went in 74, so it would have been North versus Port whenever they played 1975 at Adelaide Oval.
Nice one. What about your favourite game?
It's almost the prelim final in 2004. You know, the pressure.
It was a great game. It was a fantastic game.
One, it was a great game. It'd probably be, look, the 3 games that I'd find really hard to separate would be the 77 grand final. That was the first grand final I ever saw. You know, I cried 76 at home, listened to it on the radio. So 77 was joy. And, you know, we were called the chokers in the 2000s, but it was a little bit kinder, gentler society in the 70s, but it was just as harsh. We would have been called the chokers, because what did we lose? 6 grand finals between 65 and 77. So 77 was important, and both the flag in 2004, but more importantly, the prelim final after 3 years of, you know, stuffing up in finals. to finally make the big one.
That's it.
So they'd be three. I find it really hard to split. But if I was forced, I'd almost go the prelim final.
Sure. What about your favourite player?
Well, it's interesting. Now, I talked about 74. So 74, I was a big Andy Portleisha fan. And I don't know why, but as a Nord mate, it was between him and Greg Turnbull who was going to be the best rookie player. Then 75, I actually played footy for the school and I wore number 9 and became a big Robert Watman fan. And he was from New South Wales, so I subconsciously copied the way he played. And he used to tuck the ball underneath his arms because he came from a rugby league sort of background from Sydney. Yep. And till the day I finished playing footy, that's how I used to. If I ever went for a run or a bounce, I'd always tuck it under like he did. and then 76 was, I always admired Russell Ebert, but 76 was just. I went to a lot more games in 76 and he was just brilliant. I probably went to 8, 9 games that year and just in awe of him every game that I saw him play.
Beautiful. All right. Now, the reason for this podcast is we're going to talk about the events of 1990 and how the Port Adelaide Football Club came to join the AFL later on and all the events that happened that year. But the most pressing thing at the moment is we should probably talk about Alan Richardson first and foremost. For the past couple of weeks, he's been vehemently denying any interest in the St Kilda coaching job, but it's came out overnight and today that he's interviewing today for the job. How do we see that panning out?
I think he wouldn't have gone over there without a pretty strong indication that the job's his for the taking. He's been, as you said, he's been strongly denying rumours for a long time, and he hasn't really thrown his hat into the coaching ring at several of the jobs that have been available before this St Kilda one. It's interesting because I just posted on the boards earlier today that I think we really need to make a stand here, because I find the position he's in as director of coaching is one of the most critical at our football club, because his job's not just as an assistant coach. I mean, we're not looking at just a senior assistant here and getting a Waters in or something like that. This is a guy whose job is to establish the coaching structures at Port Adelaide into the foreseeable future that helps us produce coaches from within and makes us a strong, sustainable club that's very much self-reliant. I find the job he's in at the moment is probably even greater than that of a senior coach. And I don't think that we should just be standing aside and letting him walk out. The first thing I'd be doing is taking St Kilda to court for inducing him to breach his contract, because I really feel strongly about the importance of his role and just what a great fit he is at Port, and I'd love to keep him there.
Yeah, absolutely. Nick, what are your thoughts, mate?
I started off like forward and sort of was a bit angry. Then I thought about it and I thought, he's sort of a bit like Ken. He's been so close. He said no, and then obviously something has gone to him. He said, all right, let me go for an interview. Whether that means he's got it or not, I'm not sure, because you hear different things from. I listened to 3AW today to try and get a feel as well as a little bit on 5AA to see how serious it was. And now I'm sort of, after I reread Ford's post, it makes me think again, is that, it probably does piss me off, because it's an important thing. I'm probably the angriest at St Kilda for being incompetent and leaving it so long.
Well, that's fair enough too. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous, really.
The natural state of being.
Yeah. Look, I posted something, I think today or yesterday. St Kilda have only had one guy that's served 6 full seasons. And that was Yabby Jeans, and he won his premiership in his 6th year in 1966. He started in 1961. So Grant Thomas is their second longest. He served, 6 or 7 games after Blight got the bullet, and then 5 full years. And then Stan Alves and Ross Lyons have done 5 full years. It's
a poison chalice.
Yeah, it is
a poison chalice. I mean, everyone used to go on a couple of years ago that Port Adelaide was the poison chalice, but we've had about 7 coaches in the last 90 years.
Yeah.
And they seem to change coaches every 3 years. It's ridiculous.
Oh yeah, look, Ross Lyon walked out, so he probably would have stayed. But What I have been thinking a bit today is I think Richo's got a daughter, and she must be doing the final year for them to have stayed over there in year 12, for them to have stayed there all of 2013, not moved over. So if St Kilda threw a shitload more money, and he goes to the family, look, they've upped it by 80% what they initially offered. I wouldn't be surprised if they said, go for the interview. See what you think, see what they're offering, because it's a big thing to move. You haven't moved yet. You might have put your mind through it, but if you're going to move kids, and I don't know how many kids he's got. I know he's definitely got a daughter. I'm not sure if he's got more than that. Moving your kids away from their friends is a big thing. So I can see why there's family pressure, why he's decided to go for the interview. It would be ridiculous of St Kilda, given their experience with Blight, to say, here, you come for the interview, we'll give you the job. Surely they've learned.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky one. I'll be pretty annoyed if he leaves, to be honest, just because he's such a good fit with us. He's such a good fit with Ken and Burgess, and KT. He spoke to KT and said, "Yeah, I'm here for the long haul." And then 12 months later, if he ups and leaves, that'll be pretty disappointing, I would think.
Yeah, it would be disappointing. It's, I guess, how much anger do you have towards Richo? that's the question.
Oh, look, I mean, he's well within his rights to go for the job, and I don't feel any anger towards him at all. I mean, if he's got, if he wants to have a senior coaching career, then this would be probably not the best place to start looking, I would think. But it's a job there. He'll have almost the entire list made up of young players in a couple of years' time. He'll be able to build it himself and see where he goes from there. So yeah, look, no hard feelings towards Richo at all. But the situation is ridiculous. It is very, very annoying. Late in the off season.
It is difficult. And I think I know we don't want to point the finger at Richo, but for me, he signed a contract for a position he knew is really important for the future of our football club. I'm not that comfortable with him walking away from that now to take on the Poison Chalice job as well, because it's happened to have come up when he's knocked back 3 or 4, or knocked back even throwing the hat into the ring with 3 or 4 others. I think there comes a point where you make a commitment. He's great mates with Ken Hinkley, and sometimes you've got to stand by your decisions. And I know it's quite fashionable, to always maybe throw the baby out with the bathwater at times. I think people just seem to accept, okay, we'll make a decision because there's always more money involved. But sometimes I think you've got to stand by your decision and stand by the commitment you've made to a club to help it improve itself in a way that's really important to the future of that club.
Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, let's say we take it to court. I mean, I don't know what Stewie Jew did, but he was stopped. Okay, he's an assistant coach, I get that, but if somebody doesn't want to be there, you hang on to them. I don't know. I think we just. I know we're speculating, but I guess I'm just hoping that he goes, he has a look and says, "Bugger this, I'm not interested."
I'm just hoping that they're foxing for Choco, and this is just a ploy to sort of get Choco to sign a contract that is under what he wants.
Well, I think Mission Possible posted earlier that it's as much Richo might be interviewing St Kilda as St Kilda interviewing him, and I quite like that. Yep. And maybe that's the case. It's really hard to say, about making a stand when you don't know the full story and what really is going on. But the backflip just scared me a bit. I've got to admit, this morning I was really solid, thinking, no, he's not going to go. He's really committed to us. He's in it for the long haul. He's moving his family here. He came out last night and he said, no, I'm not interested. And I don't know how many times I have to say it. I'm not going. And then I'm looking on the net later this morning and reading he's changed his mind and he's going for an interview.
It was quite bizarre. I saw your thread this morning, and it had about 10 replies, and I read it. And I thought, oh yeah, that's fairly interesting. Whatever.
Yes. Yeah. Move on.
Yeah, we might have a new sponsor. That's good. Yeah. That'll be great.
Point of the thread.
And then I checked it 4 hours later, and there's suddenly 200 replies. I'm thinking, oh, maybe the new sponsor's come out already. And no, it's Richo's possibly leaving. I thought, God, what a shit sandwich. That's great.
So glad I looked that up today.
That's it. Well, look, we might move on from that and get on to the major discussion point of this podcast, which is the events around 1990. Something that changed the South Australian football landscape forever, in a good way, I think. Ford, I might throw to you first and just get a bit of an overview of what happened pre-1990 and maybe why the club made the decision to sort of come to talks with the AFL.
I think the possibility of an SA entry into a national competition is something that had been discussed in South Australian and Victorian football since the mid-80s. There's certainly been quite a bit of talk about it. There was quite a bit of talk of Port and Norwood going in. Certainly, I think the preference was, at that time at least, for for club-based sides to join it. It's, as is the way in South Australia, it really didn't get much beyond talk, and it stalled and stalled and stalled. And I think what was happening was, as the Victorian checkbooks got bigger and the clubs in Victoria were able to throw more money at players, South Australia basically started hemorrhaging players. Certainly Port Adelaide were hurt by it, but I think other clubs too. I think the massive coup of Carlton's in the mid-80s when they took Motley, Nailey, Bradley, and then Platten went over to Hawthorn. There was some, Port Adelaide lost other players along those lines. Abernethy and Phillips had gone probably a bit earlier than that. Philetic went during that time as well. A lot of players were starting to get swallowed up. There'd been a long time in South Australia hadn't been hit as hard as, say, WA. South Australia's always had a very parochial football stance, and players had stayed simply because they liked playing in South Australia. I mean, we hung on to Scott Hodges probably for 2 years longer than we would have, simply because he loved playing at Port Adelaide. And Port Adelaide, I think, recognised what was going on. Probably every club recognised it, but Port Adelaide decided, okay, this is got to stop. We want to be on the biggest stage in the biggest competition. This club has got to do something. I'm not saying it was entirely altruistic, but certainly it was something to stop all of these players leaving, and it was also to put itself onto the biggest stage. And I think it's the club's record over a number of years, and especially the Cale era, where won premierships in 77, 79 to 81. Cale went away to coach at Collingwood, and then West Adelaide came back, and we won another 3 in a row from 88 to 90. And the time was right. The Western Australians to join the competition. Brisbane had a team in a national competition, for goodness sake. Sydney had a team, and South Australia didn't. And I think it was just clear, where the flow of the current was happening. And in South Australian football, it was just continue to be, well, we'll talk about it. And I remember Max Bashir up on the stage after one of the grand finals and going, well, I think, we're really happy with what we've got here. We talk about going to the VFL, but this is a pretty good competition. And, it was almost a collective internal groan. And you thought, they don't want to take the step. And then in the end, Port Adelaide took it, whether, there was always a talk of us being a patsy and a setup to get the SANFL to go in. I'm not convinced that's true. I've always believed that the AFL was interested in getting Port Adelaide into the competition, that they wanted a club side. They'd had a lot of problems with these composite sides being formed, even the West Coast Eagles, and I know Nickers, RussellEbertHandball has put up the history of their club a few times, and they were a real financial basket case for a number of years, and they wanted a club that had a following and a supporter base. Alan Schwab had enormous respect for the Port Adelaide Football Club, and it was probably he that initiated that contact through Ian McKenzie to start the whole process of getting a South Australian team into the AFL.
Yep, that's fair enough too. I mean, if you look at the players that we lost, 2 VFL sides in those sort of mid to late 80s, I mean, there's just a raft of talent. You look at guys like Greg Anderson and Danny Hughes, guys like Simon Tregenza, David Brown, all these guys were drafted but chose not to go. How do you think the sort of player retention scheme had a part in that?
It allowed Darren Smith to play for about 5 more years that he wanted to in the end.
It was a factor. I think it did alleviate some of that financial concern where players were going to miss out on money. But there was also, I still remember the days when players were getting knocked back for it because clubs were putting it up as a superannuation scheme for some of their players that were never going to leave, and wanted to basically, it was almost like a Vizzy contract for Judd type of situation where it's, here we go, we can get you extra money and it's not going to cost us anything. And I think I'm pretty sure Michael Ash was knocked back for one because I don't think anyone really thought he was going to go, and he certainly never joined the Crows. Yep. And I think other clubs tried it on a bit with that. I think it played a role, but again, I think there's a very peculiar parochial mentality in South Australia at times that players will stick with their clubs and will tough it out in that situation. But again, the barriers were breaking down, the walls were coming down. I think with the younger players especially, were starting to look over the border. I mean, the older players, it's a bit harder to go over there and try and establish yourself. With the younger guys, you get in there at a decent age and jump into it. I think guys like Rick Davies and Russell Ebert said, that they should have gone over years before and really would have made an impact. I think Russell had a sensational year the year he went there in '79. He was 30 years old and played some superb footy despite the propaganda that goes around occasionally that he had an ordinary year. He seems to get lumped into Graham Corns, who got sent home halfway through the year.
Russell Ebert had a fantastic year that year.
He actually lived in Adelaide. He lived in Adelaide and used to fly over.
He trained with Port early in the week. Thursday or Friday, and trained once with North Melbourne. And he averaged 25 touches a game. I think he was second or third on both their handball and their kick lists, and came second or third in Brownlow votes for them that year, and ahead of guys like Keith Gregg and Schimmelbusch and just some absolute stars of the game.
What are your reasons, or what do you think the reasons are behind the SANFL being reluctant towards moving towards an AFL spot or a VFL spot earlier than they planned?
Well, WA had to do it. WA was like your middle-tiered European soccer clubs. They were selling players to survive. SA didn't have to do it. Also, Football Park. It's easy to bag the SANFL about Football Park because we got screwed there once we got into the AFL. But Football Park gave the SANFL a solid base that the WAFL never had, and the other reason why little Max is a hard little bastard, he had to fight Don Bradman, and with sort of Footy Park closing down, the sort of recalling the old stories, you can see why he's a nuggety little old bugger, because he went and looked at him and others at the SANFL went and looked at several sites, and the big one that they wanted to was at Islington, just past Prospect there, where the train. I think there's 2 trains, not a train station, but it's a major intersection or something. So they wanted it there, but basically Bradman stopped it, and that's why they ended up at Footy Park, because it was cheap. So you had this mentality, I think, at the SANFL, is that we've done it tough. We've taken a lot of risks, which they did. You've got to be honest and say what they, when they asked the foundation members to pay up 6 months earlier just to pay it so they could make interest payments, and that's sort of in that 6 months. That's when. With the Yom Kippur War and then the second lot of OPEC oil crisis, petrol prices or oil prices went up 400%. People forget that. So when you go through those hard times and you survive them, you then get this mentality, why the bloody hell do I got to change? We're doing all right. We don't need this upheaval. We had this upheaval 15 years ago. Whereas Western Australia had to go in, they couldn't hang on any. They were desperate. And the other thing too that for Western Australia is that the old Australian National Football Council had sort of representatives, and Victoria the VFL had 5 votes, and I think SA had 2 or 3, and WA the same, and Tassie. You needed to get 10 votes, and the VFL basically, at the start of 1986, put enough development monies into the smaller states, and they voted with the VFL to slash the transfer fees from 60 grand for every player that goes to the VFL to about 22,000. So the WA clubs knew that some clubs were selling 4 players a year, $250,000 back in 1984, 85, 86. It's a lot of money. It's the money that basically, is the difference between you. Just the WA had the independent commission because they had this thing called the Mitchell Inquiry. So you had independent people, independent of the clubs, making the decision. So West Australia came from a different point of view, whereas SA was solid. They'd gone through the hard yards of building their own stadium and the risks associated with that. They were conservative, they were more frugal, they had the Vics, the old kick a Vic, and it's ceding power. People don't cede power easily. And
I think that kick a Vic mentality is something that showed up as well again in that parochial football sense that it was almost treachery to think of heading to Victoria. I think it really did play on the minds of players. But also those players that they seem to have a very strong connection with their clubs. And as you said, the Victorian clubs just threw stupid money at the Western Australian clubs to their players. I remember when I think it was Gary Shaw, the really speedy mop-headed rover. He was a bit of a prototype of John Platten. And this is, I think the Western Australian club he played for said, you can have him for $150,000. And Collingwood paid it, and then they found out that he also was aligned to a Northern Territory club. And the Northern Territory club said, we'll have a go at this too. Yeah, we want $150,000 as well, and Collingwood paid it. And he wound up costing them $300,000. He wasn't really didn't have that much of an impact when he went over there, but it was just sort of the way that went. They had that whole Ardith Cup, or whatever it was, from year to year, their night competition, and they would bring the Western Australian and the South Australian clubs in, I think, sort of to have a bit of a look over who might fit in well in their competition and that they could buy next, and that certainly helped them in their processes. And I think it was Shaw, for example, his form in some of those games that got their attention.
Yeah. Well,
the Vic clubs seemed. I've got in front of me here is Gary Liddell's Football Limited book. And he really should do a second edition. He wrote it in 95. But the thing that comes through that was that there was almost, I'm sure it happened in WA and SA as well, but it seemed to be in the Victorian clubs, you had these really rational business people who made a lot of money, but once they got involved with clubs, they became uber fans and almost lost their rationality. And then in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s, you had ridiculous money being thrown for the glory of winning a flag. And especially the Vic saw themselves as the dominant state and, pay anything to get the best new player. I mean, I don't know if you guys have seen the film The Club, but there's a lot of truth to that about when they get that Jeff Haywood character, the great footballer from Tasmania, who they pay a ridiculous amount of money, and he's more interested in sort of, smoking a few cones and having a good time and stuff like that. There was a fair bit of truth to it. At the time, I thought it was exaggerated, but with the benefit of hindsight, it happened.
Well, let's talk about the on-field stuff. Let's leave the off-field stuff alone for a moment before we get to the actions of late July. It happened after round 14. So the first 14 rounds of 1990, I believe we were on 11 wins and 3 losses. We were sitting pretty comfortably in the top couple of teams in the competition with Glenelg. Yep. What are your memories of those sort of early rounds of 1990? I know I remember sort of, especially the Anzac Day game against Nord at Footy Park, which had 36,000 people. I think it was the most for a game at Footy Park for a minor round.
Yeah, I remember that game. That was definitely a bit. I think the only game that might have beaten it was that double header in '88. Other than that, it was the biggest. It was either the biggest or number 2, and if it was number 2, it was only that game, that double-header game, yep. The Russell Johnson Caldelina game.
Yep.
Yeah, we'd certainly. I mean, we'd been winning without really dominating games. I mean, we were rolling along quite nicely, and I think had knocked over a number of sides, and I think, as you said, it was about a 11-3, and we looked pretty good. We'd probably already won 2 flags, and it was almost at that point where Port you almost got the idea Port was sort of coasted into finals these days. All those days they did what they had to, won as many games as they had to, then just found another gear and got going. So it was really, we were cruising along. We dropped a couple that, I guess, along the way. I think a surprise loss to West Adelaide, especially where we had a lot of injuries.
Yep.
I think we'd rolled over Glenelg in sort of near the back end of that run of games, and that was the game that we agreed to move from Alberton to Footy Park to accommodate a big crowd, and I think they got nearly 25,000 there.
Yeah, won by 20 points, that one.
Yeah, that's right. And we were nicely positioned, and the usual teams, the usual suspects are up there. Norwood were up there, Glenelg were up there, and it was just travelling along nicely without being spectacular.
Except for Scott Hodges, he was over the top.
Yeah, well, even then he hadn't.
Not just yet.
It was again after the announcement. He kicked. Or you're probably going to go into that anyway. But
yeah,
he basically kicked 40 goals in 4 games.
Wasn't that mid-July? He kicked a couple either side of the announcement and a couple, because he had that 4 games where he kicked 10 goals. I thought it was 2 one side of the announcement and 2 the other side.
No, he went bang straight after the announcement. He kicked 7 goals against Torrens, which was the week before. And then it was against West Adelaide, he kicked 14, then he kicked 10, 11, and another 11 the week after that as well. So he kicked 46 goals in 4 weeks, which is phenomenal, really. I believe that's a SANFL record for, a 4-week period. I mean, he broke basically every record that year for a goal kicker.
He did. He destroyed them. He kicked 6 lots of 10 goals or more in the minor round. He was the first player to achieve that, in a single season, and he still had the finals to come.
Ridiculous, crazy talent.
Yeah.
And of course,
the one thing I remember was just the intensity of the games. Once the news broke, just the intensity, not just the crowd, but actually on the field as well, but the crowd intensity. I didn't go to a lot of the games because I was playing footy, but that's mates who went, or if you saw, they've done the replays. And I'm not talking about the KG incident, I'm just talking about just generally the public. There was this, because I went to one game after the announcement, it was just really tense.
That's right. Well, let's talk about, let's go back to the off-field and talk about what happened as the announcement broke. I believe there was almost a world war going on at the time between Iraq and Kuwait. And that got really pushed back to the back pages, really.
It's amazing. It's only on a page 2, and I still remember, I think it was one of the news telecasts at the time that led with the port story ahead of the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, and I remember the news editor at the time was actually pilloried by the national boss, saying, "What the hell are you doing?" And he's going, "No, this is South Australia. This is the news here," and it pushed that off the front page, or at least shared it.
Yep. So what happened in those days in sort of July 1990? How did it come about that we were going to push for the AFL?
Basically, Alan Schwab was going to come and speak at a business luncheon, and Bruce Webber decided to bugger it. It's now or never. It was pretty much his attitude, and the ball started rolling. The other thing that's sort of important is that Alan Schwab always wanted to be, I guess Ross Oakley wanted to be the CEO, the chief guy. So to placate him, he was called an executive commissioner, not a commissioner, not the CEO, but he got a special title, and he's the only one, if you look in the history books, he's the only one that had that title. And he decided to push, or encourage Webber whilst Oakley was on holiday. So he knew the Port people through the Big Bob, when he was involved in Richmond and Port people, but he also probably saw it as his opportunity to get the South Australians in, start the ball rolling, because that was part of his ego thing. So that's talked a little bit about in this Gary Linnell book, but it was him coming to Port for the businessman's luncheon that was the real key for Bruce Webber to decide to say, okay, let's get serious about this.
And Schwab went through Ian McKenzie, who was probably running the general store up in Corn at the time. I think he was the former general manager then, and he was the intermediary. And certainly Schwab was known to have enormous respect for Port Adelaide. He thought Port Adelaide was the best club outside of Victoria, and just saw us as a natural fit to go straight into the competition. We've established supporter base, club infrastructure in place, and I think back then it was very much we would go in with that club infrastructure. I think people sort of they view it through the lens of today, where you just see the draft and things like that. But back then, we were going to take basically a zone in with us and draw from that zone as well as from the draft over that period, and build a side up that was competitive, as opposed to poor old Brisbane, who got basically the bottom end of everyone's list to build their side, and the Western Australians who were just struggling along, certainly financially, and I guess reasonably mediocre as a club on the field, and they could see Port Adelaide would come in, be pretty strong straight away, and really get into the competition and have a presence right from the outset. Certainly one of the funny things I do remember from it is the Victorian media loved it because, one, they were able to annoy every Collingwood supporter by saying Port Adelaide coming into the AFL, they've got to be the Magpies and they're going to wear black and white, and of course the shrieks from Victoria Park could be heard over the border. And then they would go to the opposition supporters and go, hey guys, guess what, there's going to be another black and white team called the Magpies coming into the competition, and they're even more successful than Collingwood. And so of course all the opposition was, no, not another bunch of them. And it was they were having a ball at the time, the Victorian media. They loved it.
As they would.
And Collingwood were the reigning premiers, so once they heard about that, and they're not going to have our colours. Yeah, you had McAllister, the president, started, I guess, lobbying. They're not coming in. We're not going to let them in and stuff like that.
Yeah, when Webber was really bullish at the outset, and I think he'd had something of a guarantee from Schwab and Oakley that we'd at least be wearing the Guernsey and the colours. I think even back then there was a bit of talk that we might not get away being the Magpies as well. I think there was I do remember back then about some discussions around another logo, but certainly the colours and the Guernsey would be going in, and Webber was quite bullish about that. But it turned out that wasn't quite as simple as what they were thinking at the time.
Okay, so we had signed a heads of agreement that we were going to join the AFL in 1991 as the Port Adelaide Footy Club. So whereabouts did it go wrong? What happened for things to go south?
I think the commissioners, or the executive, underestimated the commission to some the commissioners of the clubs to some extent. They got very nervous because of the enormous response here in terms of legal action and media outcry and the response of the South Australians in general.
Yep.
I think the clubs also started to get a bit narky about the conditions. Port had negotiated some very good entry conditions that were significantly watered down for the entry of the Crows. And that also included airfares being covered. Where's the money coming from? They're obviously going to lose players. Players that had signed the old Form 4s or I think had been drafted were allowed to be released from that if they wanted to join Port Adelaide. There was a limit on the number, but it was a pretty significant number.
Yep.
And I think overall, the clubs started to get cold feet. I mean, there's always been a lot made about Collingwood, and there was always talk that in the beginning it was probably they didn't have the vote in the end because they knew they didn't have the numbers, and Collingwood were probably the one holdout at the time. But as it wore on, it did get harder and harder.
So what about in terms of in South Australia itself? I mean, it basically turned into a civil war.
Yeah, the problem for Port was that in May there had been this summit down at Yankalilla or somewhere down south in the Flora Peninsula. I think it was Yankalilla. What was the big? It wasn't really a resort, but what was the place down Yankalilla way? You go swimming and you ride horses and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm sure it was down there. There was a 3-day sort of summit thing, and they had a vote to say, we're going to go in because there was an invitation for 1993, maybe 92, to put a composite team in. And the story goes that Port told Dave Boyd, who was our delegate, to abstain from voting, but he voted with all the other clubs. And that's the critical bit, because when the SANFL and the SANFL clubs took Port to court, their argument was that was a deceptive vote, that they deliberately voted not to enter because they were negotiating behind their backs to enter. And that was, the judge accepted that as a legitimate argument, and that's why he was able to slap, you can't go talk to the Victorians for a month. Now, I don't know how you can do that. You can tell somebody you can't go talk to them across the border. The other thing that was, 1990 was the year that the Corporations Act changed. So I don't know whether that had a bit to do, because the AFL were a company, Port Adelaide were an incorporated association, which means they comply by the South Australian law, the same with the SANFL. There's just the common law stuff about this deceptive conduct which came into play. I've spoken to John Firth over the years about the situation, and he says that they got legal advice from a couple of QCs that they probably would have won an appeal against the an injunction that you can't go and talk to the Victorian. But he said, they would have probably ended up in the High Court, and it would have been a 12-month process, which was useless. Because if you're told you can't talk for a month and you're still in the appeals process, that doesn't really solve anything. So the acrimony was that it was a bit of jealousy, the fact that Dave Boyd had put a no vote in, and it's almost felt like it was treachery. You're selling us down the river.
And I guess as well that there was a personal liability claim against each Port Adelaide director. So at that point, then it became all of those directors that they could lose their homes, their livelihoods, and then they started to crumble as well. And in the meantime, with all of these legal actions in place stopping Port Adelaide from negotiating, the SANFL went off and negotiated themselves with the AFL, and that was okay. And we just couldn't. We tried to actually put a counterclaim in against them to stop them from doing that, and but that was just deferred by the court. Said, oh no, we'll hear that in another month, and that month was all they needed to get their own case across.